Greetings. Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the medieval church history, the series, survey on the medieval church history. And this will be the final installment in the series, as the reign of Pope Boniface VIII is a plausible conclusion for the medieval period. The two popes earlier, Nicholas IV, with the fall of the Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land, would have also been a plausible stop. But since Boniface lived right just over the turn of the century into 1303, I'll cover him, and that'll be the conclusion of the medieval period. So we left off last time with the abdication of Pope Celestine V on December 13th, 1294, after only 4 months as pope. He was the seventh pope to abdicate. Pope 193 was Boniface VIII, totally opposite to his predecessor, Celestine V. He was born baptized, Benedetto Gaetani, Gaetani, born into an aristocratic Neapolitan family at Anagni. So he was, from the disputed kingdom of Naples. Born in the year 1235. He studied law at Bologna, the premier legal college of the day. He earned an outstanding reputation as a student of the law. He entered papal service and served with distinction on papal missions to England and France. In 1281, he became a cardinal, where he surrendered to the temptation of using his position for the benefit of his family, an ever-present reality in a time when the absence of effective government meant that family was often a person's only protection. In 1290, Cardinal Gaetani was assigned as a papal legate to mediate a dispute at the University of Paris between the lay faculty and the mendicant friars. As we covered previous versions of this already earlier in the course, the mendicants, or the Dominicans and Franciscans, at this point, had successfully competed for students and positions in the university system. And the lay faculty objected. Remember, I explained this, but it was a number of videos ago, so not out of place to repeat it. Universities at the time, universities as institutions, did not charge tuition. So teachers, the professors individually, had to charge their students. Their students paid them directly. So the mendicants didn't have to charge because they lived in their community, and they lived off the community. So, whereas the lay faculty, if they didn't have students, then they didn't get paid. And so that's part of the reason. There were also theological differences and ideological differences, but it was also that. So, and this recurred over and over again, and Boniface was sent to mediate yet another of those disputes. And he sided with the mendicants against the lay faculty. The lay faculty were arguing that the mendicants, that their stated vocation was not university work. That the Dominican stated vocation was preaching, and the Franciscan stated vocation was working with the poor. So that that the lay faculty at the university was saying, by their own standards, they are not living out their vocation. So they shouldn't be permitted to do this. But previous representatives of the Pope had sided with the mendicants, saw a higher good in the influence that they could have on college-age students. And Boniface continued that. He said that it was legitimate for individual members of those communities to be assigned to such work. This earned Cardinal Gaetani, the future Pope Boniface VIII, many enemies among the lay scholars at the University of Paris. So remember these enemies. Later, when he's Pope, they will avenge their wounded vanity and their harmed wallets by inventing and promoting a new heresy, the heresy of conciliarism. Stay tuned. The following year, 1291, Cardinal Gaetani successfully negotiated a treaty between England and Aragon. Aragon is northeastern Spain, that averted a war between those two countries. When the Second Conclave of 1294 met in December of that year to elect a successor to Celestine V, it was no surprise that they turned to an accomplished person like Gaetani to avoid a repetition of the mistake they had made by electing someone who was like Celestine, who, while he was spiritually a decent, certainly a worthy person, but he was just too inexperienced to take that position in the church. So Celestine wanted to just return to his cave after abdication, but the new Pope, Boniface VIII, could not risk his being kidnapped and used by unscrupulous feudal lords, which is exactly what would have happened. So he was allowed to live out the remainder of his life in a castle, Castle Fumone, near Ferentino, until he died of an abscessed tooth, actually, which became infected. Then he got sepsis. He died on May 19th, 1296. So 2 years later, died at the age of 87. Pope Boniface was an extraordinarily talented man, which made him subject, to a greater degree than most, subject to temptations of pride. This manifested, when he surrendered to those temptations, it manifested in his behavior as impatience in dealing with people he regarded as less intelligent, which was most people. No one likes being made to feel stupid, but he had a habit of doing that, of making people feel stupid in groups, like making them look stupid in front of other people. This is a bad habit, and it earned him a long, long list of enemies, a pattern he didn't even realize until it was too late. Things began to go wrong for his pontificate in 1295. England and France existed in a condition of more or less permanent hostility, usually characterized by open murder and warfare, but punctuated by brief periods of peace while they rearmed for the next round of homicide. More often than not, the causes of such conflicts in the period could be traced to the convoluted political situation created by feudalism, in that aristocrats and royalty only wanted to marry each other. The ruling dynasty of England at the time was House Plantagenet, Plantagenet. The Plantagenets reigned over England from 1154 to 1485. They inherited the throne by means of a marriage, intermarriage with the last Norman king, Henry I. The hereditary lands of the Plantagenets were actually in France, not England. The county of Anjou, which we've mentioned, like Charles of Anjou, that county in France, was actually where the Plantagenets were from. That Anjou, along with other holdings that they accrued over the years, either by conquest or intermarriage, included the Duchy of Normandy, Aquitaine, Brittany, Gascony, Toulouse, and Guyenne. Meaning that there were times in history when the Plantagenets actually controlled more territory in France than the kings of France did. Further, all of this intermarriage meant that both the kings of England and the kings of France had claims on many of the same territories, and actually had claims on each other's thrones, plausible claims, because there was so much intermarriage. Like the King of England would say, well, I do have relatives. I have a claim on the French throne, and vice versa. So with all that in mind, in the year 1295, another war erupted between the two, England and France, over possession of Gascony in southwestern France. Let's see. All right. So. So that river there, the Gironde River. So on one side was Gascony, on the other side was Aquitaine. So it's, in other words, on the Atlantic coast, with a major river going through. So it's a wealthy, a significant, wealthy region. So both England and France, because of the centuries of intermarriage, the kings of England and France, the Plantagenets and the Capets, both had legitimate claims on the area, on Gascony. In southwest France, the contestants at the time being King Edward I of England, whom we've already met when he was still a prince. He went on crusade with King Louis IX of France, against Louis IX was dead, so against the reigning French king, Philippe IV. Edward I was King of England from 1239 to 1307. Philippe IV was King of France from 1285 to 1314. When the war, which initially was over Gascony, the Gaskin War began in 1295, it happened by malign coincidence. There was a vacancy in the position of Grand Master of the Knights Templar, one of the military religious orders. King Philip IV of France tried to get himself elected Grand Master of the Templars, which would give him control of the most highly trained fighting men in the world, at least the Christian world. He failed in this because the Templars realized what he was trying to do, and the chapter, it was a religious order, so they chose their superior by the chapter, the senior monks. Well, they weren't monks, but the brothers, the senior brothers, and they did not elect Philip. Now Philip never forgot this offense against his vanity, and one day he would have his revenge on the Templars. Meanwhile, Philip had to fight the English. Pope Boniface VIII learned that King Philip IV of France was raising money for the war by taxing French clergy, tax theft from French clergy. So he issued a bull, a papal bull, meaning an official papal document with the seal, on February 25th, 1296, titled Clericos Laicos, in which Boniface declared it immoral to tax the church to pay for wars that were not strictly defensive without consulting the Pope. So he sent this and just waited for Philip to submit. Boniface had seriously misjudged his man, Philip IV, as well as misjudged the time. Ruthless and paranoid, Philip IV retaliated by placing an embargo on all trade with the Papal States and forbidding the export of French currency to the Pope. This meant that Boniface could not collect the French portion of Peter's pence. And since the French were among the largest contributors, this was a crippling blow. Boniface was forced to back down. in July of 1297, he agreed that Philip could tax the French clergy without first consulting Rome. The same year, 1297, on the 6th of May, a young man named Stefano Colonna hijacked a convoy of papal belongings, which included a few chests of gold coins amounting to 200,000 florins. The florin, that was the gold coins, 200,000 gold coins, minted in Florence. Now, just the hijacking was typical of the criminal behavior of the time, and House Colonna was one of the most powerful in Italy, and the Colonna cardinals had supported the election of Boniface after the abdication of Celestine V. So House Colonna assumed that Boniface would take no action. But they were wrong. Boniface summoned the two Colonna cardinals. They were named Jacopo and Pietro. And he demanded, first, restitution of the 200,000 florins. Second, he demanded that they surrender, that they turn in Stefano for punishment. Now, they might have been willing to return some of the money. Probably not, but they might have returned some of it. But there was zero possibility that they would deliver up a member of their family for certain execution. That's just not the way things were done, and certainly not in Italy at the time. That they families might fight among themselves, but they would not hand over a member of their family for punishment, certainly not for execution. Or in the case of theft, at first offense, he might have just had a hand chopped off, but there was no way they were going to do that. And Boniface had to know that. I mean, he grew up in Italy. I mean, he had to know that was just the ethos of the day. So they refused, naturally, and then Boniface deposed them. He removed them from the College of Cardinals, excommunicated them, and excommunicated Stefano for his theft. This made the House Colonna enemies of Boniface. And House Colonna owned land throughout Italy, and they had connections, marriage connections, as well as economic connections across Europe. So these are bad enemies to make. The obligation of vendetta, which is part of the Italian ethics of the day, drove House Colonna to make common cause with King Philip IV of France against Boniface VIII. Together, this international conspiracy assembled a dossier of mostly baseless calumnies against Boniface, which they circulated to all the royal courts of Europe. Now, demonic fingerprints are all over the scene of the crime. They use lies to sow mistrust between the Pope and the faithful, thereby achieving division in the Church, which is always the delight of Satan, always the objective of Satan. As usual, whenever someone wishes to undermine the Church, the accusations included accusations of sexual misconduct. He was accused of adultery, fornication, sodomy. Further, they accused him of murder, and no evidence, of course, but that evidence is not required. When accusing clergy of anything. More seriously, it was argued that the abdication of Pope Celestine V was invalid because it was coerced. At least they claimed it was. That was, of course, that was not true. But again, that doesn't matter. If you're going to accuse a cleric of something, then automatically he's guilty. So they said it was coerced, therefore it was coerced, which would mean the election of Pope Boniface was invalid, and Celestine was still Pope because he was still alive. Now, the falseness of this accusation is manifest in that both of the Colonna cardinals had actually voted for Boniface. They were, and So they invented these lies to discredit the Pope after he became enemies of their family. But once again, the average Catholic doesn't know all this. All they heard was a list of crimes attributed to the Pope. And many then, as today, assumed, oh, well, if he's accused of so many things, he must have done something. The following year, 1298, King Edward I of England took advantage of a disputed royal succession in Scotland to invade, conquer Scotland, and steal it. Annex. He annexed Scotland to England. And this inspired the proto-nationalist movement in Scottish history, led by the famous William Wallace. So movie fans, the movie Braveheart, that's William Wallace. Mel Gibson was playing William Wallace. And the actor, the character in there that they call Longshanks, that's King Edward I. After this invasion, Pope Boniface issued a moral correction to Edward on June 27, 1299, insisting that Edward had no right to deprive Scotland of its sovereignty. Scotland had not attacked him. Edward rejected the Pope's authority to even comment on the matter, maintaining that this was a purely temporal affair, whereas the Pope's authority was confined to spiritual matters. As Pope Boniface had no means of enforcing anything against Edward, the result was a very public, international disregard of papal authority. The following year, Boniface attempted to make an international initiative. Well, not attempt, he did make an international initiative, which was intended to recall the minds of the faithful to religion. As you remember, from the whole Viterbo period in the late 13th century, the papacy had been out of the loop. So he's wants to remind people that the church exists. On June 29th, 1300, he opened the first Holy Year, encouraging pilgrims to come from all over Christendom to Rome to visit the major basilicas of Rome. St. Peter's, Maria Maggiore, St. John Lateran, and St. Lawrence of San Lorenzo. Initially were those four. Those who visited all those churches during the Holy Year would be granted indulgences. Indulgences that previously a member of the faithful could only have obtained by making a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But that was no longer possible because 9 years earlier, the last Latin outpost in the Holy Land fell to Islam, so it was no longer possible for Christians to make such a pilgrimage. So he's offering them this alternative, make a pilgrimage to Rome. Now, such spiritual sentiment could not be tolerated by Satan. So demonic influence operated, once again, to distract the faithful. This time by a war during the Holy Year in Tuscany, which is north of Rome, which would disrupt travel, frighten pilgrims. It probably discouraged many from coming. The fight was between competing Italian houses for control of important cities in the region, particularly Florence. So that war actually had nothing to do with the church. But somebody coming from Europe had to cross the Alps. They'd have to go through Tuscany to get to Rome. And if they hear there's a war there, well, they say, well, maybe we shouldn't go. In order to maintain the fiction that the homicides were for a higher purpose, the houses had divided into the competing parties, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs pro-papal, the Ghibellines pro-imperial. And remember those, as we covered in the 12th century, those two had political philosophies attached. So the Ghibellines, the pro-imperials, favored centralized government. They'd be, in our system, those would be the federal, the strong federal government types. Whereas the Guelphs, the pro-papal, favored decentralization, local authority. So those would be the states' rights people. The Guelphs in this particular fight, achieved victory and took control of the city of Florence with a brilliant Italian nobleman named Dante Alighieri, fighting for their cause. Demonic influence then seeped in to sow division among the victors, to divide the Guelphs. The Guelphs were pro-papal, but that has to be divided. So the satanic influence divided the Guelphs into the whites and the blacks, based on the color of the flags that they used. So the whites favored stripping the temporal fiefs and titles from the clergy, from the church, leaving them only as spiritual figures, whereas the blacks favored continuing the dual temporal and spiritual position that shaped church life under feudalism. By the end of 1300, the holy year 1300, the whites had gained control of Florence, and Dante was a white. He was a Guelph, then a white. As Florence was in Tuscany, and Tuscany's north of the Papal State, Pope Boniface could not ignore this development. He secured the military aid of Charles II, King of Naples, who, remember, was a French warlord, ruling over Italians by means of a military occupation. By 1301, Charles, acting in the Pope's name, attacked Florence, and drove out the whites, including Dante, and installed the blacks in power. The result was that the whites, including Dante, were either executed or exiled. In Dante's case, it was exile. This act permanently embittered Dante. It scandalized most Italians. From their perspective, Boniface, who was an Italian, had employed French mercenaries to kill and subjugate fellow Italians for purely political and economic objectives. Dante spent the rest of his life traveling and writing slanders of Boniface. And when he got around to writing the comedy, the Divine Comedy, he wrote it from 1308 to 1321. He placed Pope Boniface in the eighth circle of hell, which was where those guilty of fraud were punished, and in the Bolgia, the pocket of simony, those guilty of simony, having purchased ecclesiastical office. So that's in the Inferno, the first part of the comedy. And I'm sure this is superfluous, but Dante's name is spelled. His first name was Dante. Then his last name, Alighieri, Aligheri. He lived from 1265 to 1321. Dante's rage and sense of betrayal by the church also accounts for his use of Italian instead of Latin for this work. He wanted to prove that it was not necessary to use the church's language to create literature. In 1312, in a future papal reign, Dante lent his pen to a work of political philosophy that was overtly anti-papal, titled De Monarchia, on rulership, or on monarchy. In the same year as Dante's exile, 1301, King Philip IV of France arrested a French bishop at Pamiers, Bishop of Pamiers in southern France. This guy's, the bishop's name was Bernard de Sassé. The bishop did not like the king and was overheard saying disparaging remarks about the king, such as that King Philip looked like an owl. Philip translated this into a charge of treason, arguing that words bringing disrespect to the monarch undermine the foundations of the state. So that became a national security issue. Treason was a capital crime, which meant execution if found guilty. In order to do this in the medieval world, he had to be removed from the clerical state, because those ordained were considered sacred, and so it would be sacrilege to physically harm an ordained person. So in order to do this, Philip needed the Pope to remove the bishop from the clerical state, meaning reduce him to the lay state. Now, Boniface flatly refused to do this. At the end of the year, on December 5th, 1301, Boniface issued another papal bull titled Ausculta Fili, which means, "Listen, son," in which he argued that the Pope has universal jurisdiction over the church and the clergy. Therefore demanded that Bishop Sasse be released, all his possessions returned to him. If there was evidence against him of treason or anything else, Boniface insisted that the bishop and the evidence be sent to Rome for judgment. So Philip received the papal bull Ausculta Fili in February of 1302 and promptly burned it in front of his own royal court, so that there were witnesses. Philip then escalated the conflict to a new level by orchestrating a publicity campaign against the Pope. Publicity can have many definitions, but one useful working definition of publicity is that it is organized lies for the purpose of large-scale manipulation. In this, King Philip IV of France had the willing aid, enthusiastic aid, of scholars from the University of Paris, who had a long-standing grievance against Boniface for having sided with the mendicants against the lay faculty when he was still a cardinal. So they composed pamphlets, and they were copied and circulated first in France and then to the other courts of Europe, which included a forged distortion of Ausculta Fili, which asserted, the forgery read as if the Pope were asserting that the papacy has the authority to directly govern the people of France. And then, of course, it included, their writings included the farrago of all the slanders concocted by the Colonna against Boniface after he excommunicated them because one of their number hijacked the papal convoy. The logic of the forgery led readers and listeners to conclude that Pope Boniface was claiming the right to govern every nation, every city, every town, every village. Now, this is absurd, but the misrepresentations, along with the mistrust sown in previous years, and the Holy See had been largely absent for the last half of the 13th century, because during the Viterbo period, which we covered, made people ready to believe the publicity. Pope Boniface could not allow this to continue. It took him a while to find out. So that they had to, people in these countries where it was being circulated, bishops, abbots, and they'd hear this, and they'd say, well, that can't be right. So then they would write to their friends and say, did you hear this? Is that what they're saying there? And then, eventually somebody asked Boniface, is this really what you sent? The forgery, is that really what you sent to the King of France? When he found out, of course, it was not, then he had to respond. So that's the background for his most famous papal bull. If you've ever heard of Boniface VIII before this, it's because of this. The bull Unum Sanctum, November 18th, 1302. Addressing the two powers, or the two swords, view of the universe, the temporal and the spiritual. In it, he clarified that there are two powers, the temporal and the spiritual, but there are not two heads in Christendom. Christ is the head. And his authority, Christ's authority, is exercised by his vicar, the Pope. This does not mean that the Pope must directly manage the world's temporalities. But it does mean The spiritual is eternal, while the temporal is transitory. The word means that. Just means in time. So if a temporal act, a worldly act, even if committed by a king, is immoral, then the Pope, whoever the Pope is, has the right to invoke the spiritual power to rebuke, for the purpose of correction and amendment, the offender, even if that offender is the king, and if necessary, to punish that offender. So the justifying logic is as follows. All moral acts have spiritual consequences to the soul of the agent, of the person committing the act. A moral act does not cease to have spiritual consequences just because it deals with a temporal matter, like money or property. The spiritual authority of the Pope brings with it the obligation of making moral teaching and correction, in cases in which the well-being of a soul is at stake. By committing an immoral act in temporal governance, a monarch places his soul in danger. The Pope has no choice but to correct this. Otherwise, the Pope himself becomes negligent in his duty to God. As a result, a particular act of temporal governance may have to be changed at the Pope's direction. But this is for moral reasons, not because the Pope was managing all temporal affairs. Now, in the heightened emotional environment created by the king's publicity machine, this kind of precise thinking was just too arduous. All that anyone repeated about Unum Sanctum was that the Pope wants to run the world. One of King Philip's pet scholars at the University of Paris was actually a Dominican who betrayed, his order, vocation, church. His actual name was Jean Quidor. He was French, but he's best known, if you want to Google him, as John of Paris. Lived from 1255 to 1306. And his French name, his real name is Jean. And then the last name, Quidor, Quidort. In 1302, he wrote the official French response to Unum Sanctum. So this is a Dominican friar, using his education paid for by the church in service to the king against the Pope. So the response was De Potestate, Regis et Papali, which means on power, royal and papal. In it, he argued that the pontiff was the head of the church only by delegation through his election by the cardinals, and the cardinals as representatives of the faithful. So John of Paris argued that authority in the church, ultimate authority, was with members of the body of the faithful. So those who exercised authority in their name, bishops and cardinals, could remove a pope from office if they deemed it necessary. This was the first written exposition of a political theology that developed into the heresy of conciliarism. And that is going to be a contributing factor to the Protestant movement later in church history. With emotions inflamed by such demonic attacks, King Philip IV of France decided that he could move openly against Pope Boniface, a task he assigned to his chancellor, and chief reptile, Guillaume de Nogaret, William of Nogaret, Nogaret. He lived from 1260 to 1313. On March 12, 1302, Nogaret assembled a group of French bishops at the Louvre, which is now a museum, but then it was a royal palace in Paris, where he developed a plan to kidnap Pope Boniface and make him stand trial before a church council on the list of charges that had already been circulated across Europe, including the contention that Pope Celestine's abdication had been coerced, therefore invalid, so that the papacy was in fact sede vacante, since by this point Pope Celestine was deceased. Now, Frenchmen alone could not have carried out that plan of kidnapping the Pope, but, as it happened, they could call upon the willing and enthusiastic assistance of the powerful House Colonna, which still had not discharged its obligation of vendetta against Boniface for excommunicating members of their family and deposing two of their cardinal relatives. On September 7th, 1303, Nogaret, with the help of the Colonna, captured Boniface at his hometown of Anagni. The day before, he was going to publicly issue a bull excommunicating King Philip IV for his unlawful imprisonment of Bishop de Sassé. Boniface was nearly 70 years old. He was severely beaten and mistreated, and he would have been taken out of the city, but there were servants in the palace who were still loyal, and they raised the alarm, and so there was spontaneous, people in the town, a spontaneous rescue attempt. Not attempt, it worked. A spontaneous rescue worked. They managed to free Boniface, but he never recovered from the injuries he received, and he died 1 month later, on October 12, 1303. He had been in good health prior to this kidnapping, so in my book, this amounts to murder. Boniface was certainly not the first pope to have been murdered, but this was not a martyrdom for the faith. This murder took place after the public declaration of a political theology, arguing that the church should be subordinate to the state. King Philip of France was pursuing the erroneous ancient ecclesiology of Caesaropapism, that Caesar, that the church is that the church should be part of the state. And John of Paris, the traitor Dominican, had provided a scholarly argument supporting it by creating an erroneous ecclesiology of conciliarism. So these elements of the future Protestant movement have now made their appearance in history. So nothing just happens. 1517, Martin Luther, that didn't just happen. Here we have 2 centuries, a development behind it. The aftermath of Boniface's death reveals that the medieval period was truly over. Shortly after, at 2 years after, the residence of the Holy See in Avignon, southern France, began. During that 70-year period, the Renaissance began. So that material is more properly covered as part of modern history, which will all be on a separate playlist. So for now, with the Crusader kingdom and the Holy Land fallen, a pope murdered by agents of a king who was officially Catholic. France was a Catholic country. And a political theology published challenging essential church teaching. We regretfully recognize that the medieval period, as the age of faith, was over. Pope Boniface was followed as Pope 194 by Pope Benedict XI. He reigned briefly from 1303 to 1304, but since that's in a new century, I'll pick that up. That'll be in the modern history playlist, which currently begins with the year 1500. Starts with the Protestant movement, but I'm gonna, whenever I get time, I'm gonna fill that in, and put it in order to cover the 2 centuries previously, which means the Renaissance. So for now, this concludes the playlist on the medieval period. Thank you for your attention and your endurance. If you survived this long, I hope it was entertaining or helpful for you in appreciating general history as well as church history in particular. So thank you for your attention. This session and this endeavor, this series is adjourned.